for so long in exile, because even the 13th Dalai Lama went into exile when British India came up to Lhasa with a young husband expedition in 1904, and the 13th Dalai Lama had to flee to Mongolia, and then eventually to China, before he returned back to Tibet in 1909. And then just 3 months after that, the Chinese army were at the eastern frontier of Tibet. And then again, the 13th Dalai Lama had to flee into India in 1910 up to 1912, where he met with Lord Curzon, the Viceroy of the British government here in British India, and then stayed in Darjeeling for almost 2 years before he returned back. And then we removed every single Chinese out of Tibet in 1912. And they were not sent back from the Tibetan frontier, but they were sent back through India. Just recently, about 3 months ago, I was traveling in the West, in the United States and Mexico and Germany and Czech Republic and all these countries. There was an auction of a Tibetan historical document which talks about the 13th Dalai Lama's, with the 13th Dalai Lama's seal, which talks about sending every Chinese army out of Tibet through India, not through Tibet. So that was a historical document which somebody else bought it. The initial price was 7,000 pounds, but it was bought for 30,000 pounds, and we couldn't have access to that document. But still, this is part of our history. We never thought that we would have to live for so long in exile, but we are here still in exile after 65 long years. But we have established, because of His Holiness' visionary leadership, and as a true democrat, we have established democracy in exile. And we exist only because of the government of India and the people of India. That's why we have always been very, very grateful to the government and people of India for their hospitality, for rendering us all the humanitarian support to build our resilience against Chinese occupation of Tibet and to fight against this mistreatment of the Tibetans. So before we talk about geopolitics, geostrategic issues, the larger global issues, if you don't understand the basics of Tibet, then it's very difficult to understand the situation of Tibet. I start by saying the Tibetan plateau, which is the highest and the biggest plateau on earth, came about because of the tectonic shift between the Gondwanas, which is the Indian plate, and the Eurasian plate. The Gondwanas is going underneath the Tibetan plate. That is why the Himalayas is rising. So Himalayas have been rising for the last 50 million years ago. So which means we had a sea beach. Could be anywhere around this place, on the south of Himalayas. It was sea, because there was this sea between the Gondwanas and the Tibetan plate. Now if you go to the western Himalayas, you will see all these mountains are not rocky mountains. They're all, you see a lot of pebbles and sands and even remnants of sea animals in the Himalayas. That proves that Tibet was under sea at one time, or Tibet had a beach more than 50 million years ago. So even today, just day before yesterday, there was an article, a geological article, which talks about the tectonic shift that is happening between the Eurasian plate and the Indian plate, and because of which the Himalayas are still growing by 10 millimeters every single year. So today, the largest plateau on Earth has become the biggest open-air prison in this world, because it's not many people can have access to Tibet. The Chinese government does not allow people to come into Tibet and see for themselves, because as they try to disinform the world about how Tibetans live, how much Tibet has developed, how Tibet has turned into a socialist paradise. I keep saying, if Tibet is a socialist paradise, then why don't you allow people from other countries to visit Tibet and see for themselves whether Tibet is a paradise or a hell, right now, as we speak. So just to give you an overview of Tibetan history, we have a recorded history of more than 2,200 years. Going back to 127 BC. And the first king of Tibet, Nyati Tsempo, the shouldered and throned king, is supposed to have, there are several versions to where that came from, where that king came from. There is one version that this first Tibetan king was a former Kaurav prince who fled to Tibet after the Mahabharata. And then there's another version that says that the first Tibetan king came from Bengal. There's Kuch Bihar area, from your area, in this area. And then some say that the first Tibetan king came from a Tibetan region called Kongpo. So whatever it is, there is some connection with the Tibetans and the Indians going back 2,200 years. Then between 7th to 9th century, Tibet became a huge empire in Central Asia. We even dethroned the Chinese emperor at that time in this place called Xiangyang, which used to be the capital of China. And we even went up to present-day Samarkand in Uzbekistan. So that used to be the extent of Tibet's empire at one time. But unfortunately, we had to go through another 400 years of disintegration. But when Tibet first became an empire during 7th century, the first religious king of Tibet sent his minister to invent a Tibetan script. There was some sort of spoken language in Tibet, but there was no written script. So the written script of the Tibetans came from the Gupta and Brahmi scripts, the Devanagari scripts. So even today, the Tibetan alphabets are very similar to Hindi, even though the language is completely different, grammar and everything is different. If I read the Tibetan consonants, it's ka kha khanga, cha cha chanya, ta ta thana, pa pa pama, za sa zawa, sha sa aya, ra la sha sa ha a, 30 consonants, which is very similar to Hindi. You have ka kha kha ganga, and we have only 4 vowels. E, U, A, O. You have many vowels. A, E, E, U, which I learned in school. E, E, U, A, O, aha, so many vowels. But we have only 4 vowels. But the language is very rich. It is one among the 15 oldest languages in this world today. Just recently, about 2 years ago, one of our monks worked with some 300 scholars to come out with a Tibetan to Tibetan dictionary. Can you imagine how many volumes that 223 volumes of Tibetan to Tibetan dictionary. Now this has become the most voluminous dictionary in the world, because we transliterated every available Sanskrit and Pali Buddhist text into Tibetan from 8th century to 13th century, before Buddhism almost vanished out of India. Because we were told by Shantarakshita, the first Buddhist monk to come to Tibet, along with Padmasambhava, that since you already have a language, why don't you transliterate these Pali and Sanskrit Buddhist teachings into Tibetan, which we did over 5 centuries. And today we are proud to be a repository of one part of ancient Indian wisdom that is based on ahimsa, non-violence, and karuna, compassion. Right? And His Holiness' message through the world is based on what he studied from the ancient Indian wisdom. So even during these 400 years of disintegration, many of our translators went to India to study Buddhism and then came back to Tibet and started the other traditions of Tibetan Buddhism called the Sakya tradition or the Kagyu tradition, aside from the Nyingma tradition, which has been there from 7th century. Then by the end of these 400 years of disintegration, I was recounting this historical fact, which is not known to too many people, that Bakhtiyar Khilji sent 10,000 army from Kuch Bihar into Tibet after destroying Otantapuri and Nalanda and all these bigger Buddhist monasteries in India. If Bakhtiyar Khilji had been successful in reaching Tibet, then he would have destroyed Buddhism in Tibet as well. There would be no remnants of Buddhism. But fortunately for the Tibetans, even when we were going through this disintegration of disunity inside Tibet, we were forceful enough to counteract the Khilji army and send them back. There were stories about the Kamrups also fighting with the Khiljis in the region. So this fact is not very well known to many historians as well. Then we developed relations with the Mongols. When Mongols became a big power in Central Asia, led by Genghis Khan, we surrendered to the Mongols in the beginning of 13th century, just around the time when Bakhtiyar Khilji was sending his army into Tibet. in the beginning of 13th century. Then we developed this relation with the Mongols called the priest-patron relationship, because Mongols didn't follow any spirituality in a sense. So they were merciless in their approach when they conquer lands. They killed everybody here. Then when they go to Kolkata next, Kolkata surrenders by itself because everybody is fearful of Mongols' tyranny. But they found a Tibetan Lama, Sajapendita as a spiritual leader, and that is how we developed this priest-patron relationship. Even today, our Mongolian friends would say, oh, we were warriors at one time. You people, you Tibetans tamed us down with teachings of Buddhism. So that is how they used to respond. So we had our relations mostly with the Mongols rather than the Chinese. When Mongols, we already established relations with the Mongols, and then Mongols invaded China. Kublai Khan invaded China from 1271 onwards, and he conquered the whole of China by 1278. Right? So that period, when the Mongols ruled China, it is called the Yuan period in Chinese history. But the Mongols were there even before the Yuan, or even after the Yuan. So our relation with the Mongols went up to 1720, up to 18th century. But when China was, the Mongols were overthrown by the Ming Chinese, who are the real Han Chinese. In 1368, the Ming ruled China from 1368 to 1644, for almost 300 years. But Tibetans had hardly anything to do with the Ming Chinese. Then the Mings were overthrown by the Qings in 1644. That is just 2 years after the 5th Dalai Lama had taken over the spiritual and temporal leadership of Tibet. If you do comparative study between China and Tibet, you will find this difference of 2 years after the 5th Dalai Lama took control over Tibet and the assumption of the Qing rule in China. But if you watch Chinese Kung Fu movies these days, contemporary stories, you will find that the antagonists are always Manchus, the Qings, and the protagonists are always Chinese, if you look at the stories. That is because the societal perspective is that the Manchus are not Chinese, they are invaders. So this also needs to be understood. So we developed our relation with the Yuan or with the Mongols, with the Ming on a separate level, not too much with political issues, but more on religious issues. Then we developed relations with the Qings. And the Qings were most powerful between 1735 to 1795 for almost 60 years. Then they themselves went through what Chinese leaders today call as 100 years of humiliation, which starts from late 1830s. So when the Chinese cannot look after themselves, how can they control Tibet? From mid-19th century to the beginning of last millennium. Right? So British India used to play this game. If you find time, please read the book written by an Indian former ambassador called Dilip Mehta, who was part of our panel discussion day before yesterday or 3 days back in Delhi. We commemorated the 75th year of His Holiness' assumption of temporal and political leadership at the age of 15 in 1950. So and then then the Qing dynasty fell in 1911. And I was talking about the 13th Dalai Lama's time, when the 13th Dalai Lama returned back to Tibet. In between, Tibetans were invaded from central Tibet by the Young Husband expedition of British India. Then from northeastern Tibet, the warlord called Mabufang invaded Tibet. From eastern Kham region, the Qing generals were attacking Tibet. So Tibet was being attacked from all three frontiers. After the fall of Qing, then Tibet reiterated its status of independence in 1913 along with Mongolia. And then in 1914, independent Tibet was signatory to the Shimla Agreement, which defines the McMahon line, or the boundary between Arunachal Pradesh and Tibet, which is still being honored by India. And it was signed by independent Tibet. There was a Chinese plenipotentiary, but he did not ratify. the final agreement of the 1914 Shimla Agreement that delineates the boundary between India and Tibet. So this is just to give you a short history of Tibet. We have never been directly ruled by any foreign power, including China, and the 14th Dalai Lama had to assume the spiritual and temporal leadership at the age of 15 in 1950, just before we were forced to sign the so-called 17-point agreement that was imposed by the Chinese government. And His Holiness tried to live under those 17-point agreement for 8 long years from 1951 to 59. Then the Chinese government trampled on all the provisions of the 17-point agreement, and His Holiness had to repudiate this in Tezpur, as the Honorable Vice Chancellor mentioned in his introductory speech this afternoon. So this is just a brief account of Tibetan history, and then how we got settled here in India after His Holiness reached Indian soil on 31st March 1959. His Holiness came through Arunachal Pradesh, came to Tezpur, and then he lived in Mussoorie for about 1 year. And then we were moved to this present location called Dharamshala in Himachal Pradesh. By 1960, May 1st, His Holiness was in Dharamshala. Not even 1 year after coming into exile, His Holiness introduced democracy in exile. And today, we are the only refugee community that has a fully functional democratic polity. We have a Supreme Justice Commission that functions more like an arbitration rather than a court, even though we do follow all due processes of law, but we don't handle criminal cases because we live in India and we have to conform to Indian laws. But we do handle administrative and civil cases within the Tibetan community. And then we have our own parliament with 45 members representing territories as well as provinces of Tibet. And then we have a cabinet now led by my position, Sikyong, and we have 7 departments or ministries, Ministry of Home, Religion and Culture, Education, Health, Security, Finance, Information and International Relations. So we have 7 departments and 7 ministries. And we have our own election commission. We are the only partyless democracy in this world. Acharya Vinoba Bhaveji had written about partyless democracy, but we are the only practicing partyless democracy in the world. And Tibetans in exile are about 130 to 140,000. We are not that many in number, but we are spread across 26 different countries all over the world. And we are in 37 locations in India, in 10 different states and 2 union territories. And we are also scattered around Nepal. We don't have that many communities in eastern India except for Arunachal Pradesh, in Tizu, Meo, Tenjigang, and some places in Arunachal East and west of Arunachal Pradesh. We have a small community in Dimapur. We have a small community in Shillong. Other than that, the bigger Tibetan communities are in South India, in the state of Karnataka. Because when His Holiness came to India in 1956-57, he visited Nagarjuna Konda, the birthplace of Nagarjuna, the founder of the Nalanda tradition of Buddhism, and met with Nijlingappa, those days of Karnataka. And when His Holiness came into exile, and when Pandit Nehru wrote to all the chief ministers as to who would be willing to provide land for Tibetan rehabilitation, Karnataka was the first to offer 3,000 acres of land, and that is where I was born. So I'm very much an Indian in that sense. I've never seen Tibet. So to fulfill my emotional needs, I go on the boundary from Arunachal Pradesh to Ladakh, and then see Tibet from this side of India. So the reason why I mentioned about this, there's also some pictures here. I thought maybe it would be good for your memory. We call our land the land surrounded by snow mountain ranges. We have that in our prayer also. In Tibetan, we say the Kangri Rave Ko Shingam Chong. This you control Chigore. Screen here. So you can, this is a satellite image of Tibet. How high it is, when I say it is the highest plateau on earth and the biggest plateau on earth. This is a satellite image taken from Indian Ocean, and that shows the elevation of Tibet. This also shows how Tibet is surrounded by snow mountain ranges. You have from Arunachal Pradesh up to Afghanistan, the Himalayas. On the west, you have the Karakoram range. On the north, you have the Kunlun range and the Nyenchen Thangla range. And so many mountain ranges on Tibet, inside Tibet. That is why it was physically not possible for too many people to come into Tibet. And for also Tibetans to go out of Tibet, because you have to climb that many mountains and down, valleys and mountains and valleys. So we can count the number of Westerners who came into Tibet on our fingers. So this is just a picture to show you how Tibet is surrounded by snow mountain ranges. And then Westerners started coming into Tibet by late 15th century on their way from China and all that. Then there were the Jesuit missionaries, then there were the Capuchin missionaries who came into Tibet, because Tibet was considered the last frontier where Christianity could not spread. So there were rumors during Humayun's time in India that some Christians got lost in the mountains. And that is why the Jesuit priests went to look for the lost Christians. Whether that's true or not, it was a different matter, because traders from different parts of the world bring in so many stories into Delhi during Humayun's time. And then the Westerners started calling Tibet the roof of the world. Why, again, the roof of the world? Because the average elevation of Tibet is about 4,880 meters, or 16,010 feet above sea level. It's that high. I was mentioning about my visit to Japan. I travel all around the world and speak to many universities and schools, as well as advocating with governments. So I asked them, which is your highest mountain in Japan? They said, Mount Fuji. How high? 3,700, 3,800 meters. And I said, that's like base camp in Tibet. You start climbing from there. So that's how, just to give them an imagination of how high Tibet is. So according to NASA, it's the highest plateau on Earth, and it's the home to Mount Everest, bordering between Nepal and Tibet, 8,848 meters, or 29,029 feet above sea level. And Tibet is huge. One time, a Pakistani journalist asked me, which is bigger, Tibet or Bhutan? You need about 50 Bhutan to make one Tibet. So Tibet is very big. It's about one fourth of China's size, because China is 9.7 million square kilometers. Tibet is 2.5 million square kilometers. It's almost 10 times the size of UK. It's bigger than Mexico, almost 2/3 of India, and 1/4 of China. So that's how big Tibet is, but then the population is very sparse. So even today, the Tibetan population on the Tibetan plateau is only about 7.5 million Tibetans. So this I already mentioned. It was formed because of the tectonic shift between the Eurasian plate and the Indian plate some 50 million years ago. It continues to grow by 10 millimeters every year. And the human habitation on the Tibetan plateau dates back to 30,000 years. Then now environmental scientists, even including Chinese environmental scientists, call Tibet the third pole. The reason? Because aside from North Pole and South Pole, Tibet has the largest amount of glaciers and permafrost that feeds all these major rivers in Asia. That is why Tibet is also called as the water tower of Asia. There is the largest amount of glaciers and permafrost. It has about 46,000 glaciers according to UNEP, and it holds about 14,500 cubic kilometer of ice. That's according to the Chinese Academy of Sciences, and it's crucial for global climate regulation. Tibet is sometimes called as the rainmaker of Asia because of the flow of jet streams over the Tibetan plateau, and the impact of El Nino, the warming up of Pacific, defines which are going to be hotspots in India, for example. And where there will be more depression, where there will be more rain, it's dictated by the climatic conditions. All the monsoons around Tibet are dictated by the climatic conditions in Tibet. Not very well known. Those who are in the field of environment, they would know better as to how these things shape up. Even we live in a very interdependent world. Just before I left to Brazil about 2 years ago, I saw this report by an environmental group who studied the correlation between the climatic conditions on the roof of the world, which is on one part of the world, and the lung of the world, the Amazonia, and in Latin America. And they found over a period of time that when there is more rain in Amazonia, there is less snow in Tibet. And when there is more snow in Tibet, there is less rain in Amazonia. And the same impact on the in the North American continent as well. And the heating up, now you see a lot of heat waves in Europe. Heat waves in Europe are also because of the melting of ice on the Tibetan Plateau. Because the melting of ice on the Tibetan Plateau is twice the degree of the normal melting, warming up of the global warming, and it's 3 times on the poles, 3 or 4 times on the poles. So when ice starts melting on the Tibetan Plateau, that increases the heat waves in Europe. And you will see more and more heat waves going into Europe in the coming years. It has been increasing over the years. And the Tibet is also now called as the water tower of Asia, because from Tibet, the Yellow and the Yangtze River, the 2 main lifelines of China, without which China cannot support its 1.4 billion people, originate from Tibet. The Yellow River, which originates from my father's land, goes into China, and it's a cradle of Chinese civilization. Then you have the Mekong going into 5 Southeast Asian countries, from Burma to Laos to Cambodia to Thailand to Vietnam. Right? And then you have the Irrawaddy going into Burma. Then you have the Brahmaputra that originates from Western Tibet and then enters through Arunachal Pradesh in Tuting area. I went to that place because we have some Tibetans there. And then comes into from Arunachal to Assam. Now China is building a mega dam at this place called Methok. It's going to produce 2.8 times the hydroelectricity than the Three Gorges Dam, which is the biggest in the world, built on Yangtze River in China. And they are investing $260 billion to make that work. And some 2-3 years ago, I was in Tuting, because with the help of the Arunachal Chief Minister, we went in a helicopter, and the helicopter pilot also took us over the Brahmaputra up to Tuting, and we could see that Brahmaputra was very murky. It was not rainy season. The river was not in spate, but yet very murky. And when you look from the helicopter, all the tributaries that joins the Brahmaputra from the hills were pristine, clear water. Which means, when we reached Tuting, I asked them, since how long has this been the case of murky water, Brahmaputra water? Well, it should be pristine clear. And they said it has been going on since 2017, 2018, which means the work on the dam has been going on for that long. And they announced it only last year, on 24th of December, 2024. They announced the beginning of this project, and this year, just a few months back, they started saying we started construction of this building. But the fact is they have already done quite a number of work there. Now you cannot hide it from satellite images. Now they have to announce. There's no other way. But how much, because as I mentioned, the formation of the Tibetan Plateau and the ongoing seismic tectonic shift that is happening, the whole of Himalayas is very prone to earthquakes from Afghanistan to Burma. You always hear about some or the other earthquake of 3 to 7 on the Richter scale. So if something happens to the size of that kind of a dam inside Tibet, then what could be the consequences on the downstream rivers, including Assam? It is going to have serious human catastrophe if it has to happen. So these are some of the things which binds us, not just the river that flows from Tibet and into your country, and the sharing of civilizational values. Those are one thing, but then currently what China is doing on the whole of Tibet, including building up of dams. We already counted 190 dams built by China on rivers that originate from Tibet that goes into China, and also transnational rivers like Brahmaputra and Mekong. And we already hear about a lot of changes that are happening to the livelihood of people who are living downstreams in Thailand, in Laos, Cambodia, and all these places. But these countries are not able to speak up to China. When we first organized the water conference in 2007, when I was working in Delhi as the director of Tibetan Parliamentary and Policy Research Center, nobody was bothered. Nobody talks about water issues. But all the countries that I mentioned here, from Pakistan to Nepal to India, Bangladesh to 5 Southeast Asian countries and China, 10 countries are some of the most densely populated areas in this world. Some estimate that between 1.8 billion out of 8 billion people in this world have something or other to do with rivers that originate from Tibet. Some say that the Third World War could happen because of water. If that is the case, then Tibet is a huge bio hotspot. And in all these regions we are talking about, these are all food balls of Asia. So we are talking about serious food security and water security in future, because China does not share any hydrological data with any of its downstream. Forget about water sharing. So this is the situation right now. What is happening inside Tibet is something that you cannot imagine. What is taken for granted here in India as a democratic country does not exist in Tibet. Even in 21st century, there is no political freedom whatsoever. You can't even carry a picture of the Dalai Lama. If you have a picture of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, you go to jail. You say, long live Dalai Lama, you go to jail. It's more like George Orwell's 1984 coming into reality, where the state surveils and controls all of its population. Now, the present governments under the Xi Jinping's leadership is, if there are no nationalities, then there would be no nationality issues. Which means, can you kill all the Tibetans? Can you kill all the Uyghurs? Can you kill all the Mongols to make sure that there are no nationalities? That cannot be done. So what they are doing right now is striking at the very root of our identity, whether it's Tibetan language, because now about 1 million Tibetan children are put in colonial-style boarding schools, where they are kept away from family, away from their language, away from their culture. The whole idea is to turn a whole generation of young Tibetans into Chinese. I also tell our Indian authorities this is a security concern for India, because Tibetans, as Professor Swamdeep Datta said, that we have a lot of respect for India. We consider India as our guru, the land of Aryavrat. That same feeling will not remain with the younger generation if all the younger generations of Tibetans are turned into Chinese. And they are taught only Mandarin language. So our language is being wiped out. And then Buddhism with Chinese characteristics. Sometimes they themselves don't know what it means by that. So there is no religious freedom at all. In all the monasteries where we used to have thousands of monks, now it is reduced to 200 to 300 monks. And you can become a monk only when you reach the age of 18, and that's also very limited. For a monk or a nun to get admitted into a monastery, you need at least 4 guarantors to make sure that you don't commit any political crime when you're a monk. So the monasteries are under 24-hour surveillance through CCTVs. Management of the monasteries have been taken over by multiple security agencies, because there are multiple security agencies. And now Chinese government wants to be responsible for recognition of reincarnated lamas. Since 2007, they passed this order called Order Number 5. And this is aimed at the 15th Dalai Lama, the yet to come Dalai Lama. They are not bothered about the living 14th Dalai Lama. And they claim that Tibetans are using this as a political tool, whereas they themselves are using it as a political tool. So Chinese government has 3 positions on this. One is that they will look for the 14th Dalai Lama's reincarnation within China. And His Holiness' response is, I will be born in a free world. So right now, of course, Chinese government is asking His Holiness to come back. But the condition is that once His Holiness comes back, he should stay back for good. And His Holiness says, if I get to go to Tibet in China, I will go, but I will not live there because there is no freedom there. So his response has been very simple. I'll be born in a free world if Tibet is not free by that time. And the second position of the Chinese government is that by tradition, the Tibetans will have to use the golden urn. Now, historically, the so-called golden urn is supposed to have come into being in 1793, when the Qings were quite powerful and had little influence on Tibet. But then I asked the Chinese government, what about the 8 Dalai Lamas that were there before 1793? Do you mean to say that the 8 Dalai Lamas were not chosen through the traditional means, and the 8 Dalai Lamas were not Dalai Lamas, in which case there cannot be a 9th Dalai Lama or a 10th Dalai Lama? Right? And the third position of the Chinese government is that the government, a communist government that does not believe in any religion, wants to be responsible for recognition of reincarnate lamas, because they know that if they can control the 15th Dalai Lama, then they can control Tibet and the Tibetan people. So His Holiness has a very wise and humorous response to this by saying if the Chinese government is really serious about Dalai Lama's reincarnation, they should study Tibetan Buddhism first and believe in the concept of life after death. If you don't believe in the concept of life after death, you can't have reincarnations. And if the Chinese government is really serious, then they should look for Mao Zedong's reincarnation first, Deng Xiaoping's reincarnation second. Now even Jiang Zemin is not with us, so they should look for Jiang Zemin's reincarnation. Then maybe the Dalai Lamas. This is His Holiness' humorous and wise response to the Chinese government about his own reincarnation. Now if we look at global politics, now it's very dynamic. We can't make out, unless you watch it over a longer period of time, it's very difficult to understand the global dynamics as it is evolving today. We travel to so many countries, we listen to so many people, we speak about our experience. We also keep watching what China is doing at every multilateral forum, from the United Nations to regional blocs like APEC or SCO, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, BRICS. Every multilateral platform, wherever China is, we always watch what China is doing. And we also watch India-China relations. India, as we speak right now, there's a spat going on between Japan and China, just because the Japanese Prime Minister said something about Taiwan. And it has roiled up into a big spat that involves a lot of tariff also. So it's not President Trump who introduced tariff as a mechanism to control other countries. It was China way back in 2010 when they stopped supply of rare earth materials to Japan. That is how it started. Even today, China is using rare earth as a chokehold on governments in the United States, in Europe, and also on India. The Chinese government condition is, we'll sell you rare earth, but you will have to supply us end user certification that makes sure that it's not used for military purposes or it's not rerouted through to United States. And the same conditions are being applied to European countries. And China today is the factory of the world. They produce about 35% of world's manufactured goods. But they themselves have a lot of problems also within China, because the domestic consumption is not increasing. After 2-3 years of COVID and the very strict lockdown, people's income went down. There's too much focus on manufacturing now. You must have heard about the housing bubble in China. That constitutes about 25% of China's GDP. It's a huge amount. They built so many apartments, so many buildings, now they're not able to sell or not able to finish those buildings. And government is not giving them incentives. Local governments are going bankrupt, because earlier they used to make money by selling land, because land used to be valuable. Now the housing prices have gone down, land prices have also gone down. So the local governments are not able to make that much income to spend on welfare activities for their constituency. But the central government is not helping them out. They did subsidize with 1.1 trillion yuan, but that's not enough. You need at least 8 billion yuan, 8 trillion yuans to lift the local debts from that position. And we are talking about serious unemployment problem in China and overaging. The last number was between 18 to 21%, which comes to about 12.5 million youths between the age of 16 to 24 that are unemployed in China. And every single year you have 11, 12 million Chinese coming out of universities. The one-child policy went on for too long, and now there's no morality also among the young Chinese. They want to get married but have no children. Because the idea is if you have one child, you spend all your earnings on your child. So what's the use of working so hard? There is also this concept of lie flat. Younger generations not working because the work culture is so toxic. And China is going through a deflationary trend. China is the only country that's going through a deflationary trend. Everywhere else you see inflationary trends. Now, because of the deflationary trends, there's too much price competition within China that keeps reducing the price. And of course, factories will have to make money, profit, and their profit gets dwindled. And then the labor cost also goes down. It has a cyclical impact on the Chinese economy. So it's very important to study not just the political developments inside China, where we are talking about Xi Jinping using anti-corruption as a tool to make sure that all his opponents are drowned out. In Russia, you see all these oligarchs jumping from the buildings and dying. In China, you see former leaders dying in swimming pools. So there's a pattern to communism. There's so much filled with paranoia. I keep saying Putin and Xi Jinping doesn't have good sleep, because they are filled with paranoia. If you listen to stories, you will be surprised that, in the Chinese hierarchy, above the rank of deputy minister, you have about 1,000-strong leadership. And there are 7 leaders in the Politburo, and then another 24 members outside that. None of them have dinner with each other. Can you imagine leaders not having dinner with each other? Because they could be accused of anything going wrong. And then now mid-level military staff also, not more than 3 people can have meetings together without the permission of the president. So that's the level of paranoia we are talking about. The Chinese army has become what it used to be during Mao's time. Now even army men, if he or she wants to get married, the spouse has to be vetted by the government, because they don't trust anybody. And the overaging is also a big problem for China, not just in Japan, but overaging is happening everywhere, but in China it could be more acute in the years to come. So that is why I keep saying, when we reach out internationally, if you want to bring China on its knees, give them less business. Because otherwise, if you look at the numbers, it's more like the democracies are strengthening the authoritarian regimes. And I keep telling that to the United States, I keep telling that to the Japanese, Taiwanese, because it's the United States who made China strong for what it is. You don't have to read too many books. I keep telling the Americans also, just read one book, Kissinger on China. That's enough for you to understand how much United States have made sure that China does not fall down. It was Kissinger with Nixon, opening up of China, re-establishing diplomatic relations, investments, getting China into WTO in 2001, giving China the opportunity to organize their coming out party, the Olympics of 2008. Now, if you look at how China developed from 2000 onwards, it's mostly US investments and US technology that took China to the level where it's today. And then our friends say, the dragon is biting at us. Then I tell them, dragon at one time was very weak. It's you all, Americans. America has more than 300 billion trade deficit with China. And that's also one of the reasons why President Trump is imposing all these tariffs to balance the trade. The 27 EU countries have 400 billion trade deficit with China every single year. And as we speak, in the last 3-4 months, the imports from China has increased by 20-30% in almost all the European countries, let alone the Southeast Asian countries. If you listen to the finance ministers of Southeast Asian countries, from Philippines to Malaysia to Indonesia to Vietnam, you will find that they are all worried because imports from China has increased, just like in Europe, it has increased by 20-30% to Southeast Asian countries also. And you can't beat the prices of Chinese. Then they will kill all your small industries and medium industries. And that's what I tell the Mexicans also. So if you don't understand the dynamics, whether it's military or whether it's, and it's because of China's hegemonic ambitions that defense expenditure of all the neighboring countries are increasing. Japan has changed its course from a Pacific state after the Second World War now to acquiring arms to protect against whom? China. Taiwan has to spend more. There's no choice. For New Zealand, security was never an issue several years back. Now it is one. Australia is spending over $360 billion to buy 7 nuclear submarines for the first time to protect against whom? From China. Palestine, the Philippines have a perennial problem with China on the Scarborough Shoals. Same thing with the Spratlys and the Paracel Islands, with Vietnam, with Malaysia, with Indonesia, Brunei, and in India is also spending so much money. If you visit from Arunachal Pradesh to Ladakh, you will see how much infrastructure development that India is making, which India has never invested in. Now it's happening. So it's all being fueled by China's hegemonic ambition. We started when the communists came into power by invading Tibet. And China today, when you talk about Japan-China relations, China keeps saying, oh, Japan never apologized for the invasion of China in the last century, and they have never apologized and they don't recognize all that. But what has China done to the Tibetan people? They don't talk about this. They don't talk about the colonization of Tibet by China. They talk about the colonization of China by other countries. So China always has a double standard. And when it comes to United States, now they say, oh, United States is not treating us equal. But when China is dealing with India, do you think China is treating India as an equal? No, they don't. We all know this for a fact. Right, so we have to look at the economic issues, we have to look at security issues, then we have to look at the political situation inside China to understand broadly what's happening around there. The Chinese political system is very opaque. It's very difficult to find out what changes are happening. But if you watch over a longer period, like let's say from now to about 2-3 years ago, you will find there are symptoms of a bigger malaise. People that Xi Jinping himself appointed in the rocket forces now are being removed by Xi Jinping himself. Well, of course, there are speculations whether it's because of Xi Jinping's own volition or he has been forced by other forces within China to take these steps. But it's the same people that Xi Jinping appointed, and particularly in this group called the Rocket Forces, which handles missile and nuclear technology for China. It means a lot. Some people ask me, do you think China will attack Taiwan now? I say China is not ready yet. They are not. They have so many problems, politically also, which is very much under the surface, which we don't normally get to see. But if you keep your eyes and ears open, then you can listen in to a lot of stories that are happening within China right now. So China is not a monolith like what some countries are trying to understand. There are also a lot of vulnerabilities of China that we need to understand as we understand the strength of China. So it's very important for us to understand the geopolitics of the whole region, to get a holistic view of the political dynamics that are shaping the world today, so that you know exactly what you need to be doing in future. And the reason why I try to reach out to as many universities as possible, I started with Oxford in the UK, with Aberdeen, Westminster University, Warwick University, And then my last engagement was speaking at Harvard University last 2 weeks ago, just before coming here. And speaking here at your university is definitely an honor for me. And I really hope you learned something from, you just don't believe everything I said. You also need to study, analyze, and find out whether what I said was true or not. That is the job of a student, that's the job of a researcher, to find out the truth from facts. So I will stop here and